Hi guys. Finally, I was able to finish the first video for you guys for Unit 8. So Unit 8, we're going to talk about the first 5 sections, and the first one has the sources of pollution. And here there's a picture of one of the places that has a lot of different pollution. We're going to look at sedimentation pollution or sedimentary pollution. So that's one kind. And we also talked in class, one of the case studies that you guys presented was the Chesapeake Bay and how NASA is helping that problem to, how they are addressing the problem. Anyway, on these sources of pollution, we just need to focus on two sources of pollution. The first one is a point source versus a non-point source. So we need to know the differences between those two. But by that, we need to first know what is water pollution. So water pollution that's happening to any aquatic biome, and we're going to refer to biomes here on this chapter, it's going to happen because of different types of pollutants, as we've seen on the previous chapter, but that involves that those pollutants are coming from or that affecting in three different ways. When something is called a point source is a distinct location, a specific location in which I'm putting some kind of pollutant or waste into a waterway. In comparison to a non-point source, in which that can come from just different areas into either a watershed, for example, that would be a non-point source. And then the groundwater pollution would affect our groundwater, especially like we've seen on the previous chapter with heavy metals and some radioactivity as well. So this chart is telling you the differences between point source versus non-point source. Again, besides knowing that they affect in different ways, they come from different ways, you also need to know what is the effect in between the two of them, that a treatment plan is a possible solution for only non-point sources. And the examples are the main thing about knowing point source versus non-point source. So for example, a point source is going to be a specific pipe that comes from a farm, that is coming from an area, from an industry, but not all from an urban area or from one city. So over here, for example, these are examples. These pictures over here are examples of non-point sources. So non-point sources are coming just from different areas like agriculture, rural homes, city streets, suburban. Everything that just kind of ends in this area is going to be coming from non-point sources, because we cannot locate this pollution back to a specific source. It's just coming from all of those sources. Point sources, however, as you can see, are going to be specifically to one location, like a wastewater treatment plant, like a factory. So those would be point sources. So if we want to take a sample of water and know the pollution, something that has been polluted would be downstream, and something that will help us to be our control will be upstream from the point sources. That wouldn't be true for the non-point sources, right? So again, anything, if you, I don't know, for some reason you get a question on the test in which you have to identify a point source versus a non-point source, this is a non-point source because it's coming from urban development. So this contamination or this pollution produced, we don't know where specifically from the urban area is coming from. It's probably a combination of different places. Same way for this one, if we don't have a specific point, it would be a non-point. Same for this one as well, because we could have different areas affecting that location. And a point source, right? Again, this is point versus non-point. These are point, right? A smokestack or any kind of pipe discharge into a specific area. Those would be the only two types of point sources. Okay, and that was it. So 8.2, human impact. So how are we affecting the ecosystems? This part has a lot of different areas. It's not focused on a specific topic. So for example, we're going to talk about the range of tolerance that we've seen before. We're going to talk about coral reefs, oil spills. We're going to talk about dead zones. What is an oxygen sac curve? What are heavy metals, litter, sediment, and just mercury or anything else. So again, these are just different concepts that we need to know. So human impact, all of these sources of pollution, and some of the concepts here, like what is an oxygen sac curve, are going to be part of the 8.2. Okay, so first let's remember what is homeostasis. So homeostasis is the ability of an organism to maintain an internal stable environment. So homeostasis is important on any ecosystem because of all the different inputs and outputs that are happening on that ecosystem. And some of the inputs, unfortunately, would be the amount of nutrients, it would be any kind of abiotic factors and biotic factors that would affect that ecosystem. Of course, that point of homeostasis is reached in different ways depending on the type of organism that we have. We have some generalist species versus some specialist species, and they do have a different response to the type of factor that is affecting them. Now, this is a list just for you to remember what are the different abiotic factors that I can consider. And because we're talking about terrestrial versus marine ecosystems in Unit A, we need to remember that even though it's terrestrial and marine, most of the abiotic factors that we need to talk about is going to be referring to anything that's aquatic ecosystems that involves marine and freshwater ecosystem. So I know you've seen these, and I just took them out from your previous units. I believe this is unit 2. So we talked about something called the law of tolerance, which is going to explain how these abiotic factors over here will reflect a different effect depending on the type of organism that we're talking about. For example, if we take pH of one of those abiotic factors, we're going to find that a specific species is going to have a preferred niche, right, in which that species will have an optimum range of development, growth, reproduction, right? The population is going to be at max here, but it's also going to have a tolerance range in which that population would have a specific a stress, right, in which it's going to be kind of like tested because the pH range has been altered from the optimum range. And then if we pass that tolerance range, then that is going to be the zone of death in which that species might go extinct because of in this case, this abiotic factor has been changed too much. Another abiotic factor could be temperature, for example. And so again, any kind of organism, these are similar graphs, right? I just put the two that I've showed you in the past, so you can remember these. But outside that range, organisms are going to experience, again, the physiological stress, the limited growth. I'm not going to have a lot of growth. They might exhibit stunted growth or just no growth at all. There is going to be reduced reproduction and in the extreme cases, it would be death. Now, one way to measure these abiotic factors is, for example, the water quality. So if we talked about good water quality on an ecosystem, we're going to find organisms that are more of a specialist, like trout or bass amphibians, or just more diversity in general. But a poor water quality test, which by the way you're going to do one in one of your labs at the very end, would be the presence of carp, catfish, or worms or bacteriofilms, just generally species that can't stand any kind of change of the abiotic factors that we have discussed. Okay, coral reefs. So coral reefs, again, in aquatic biomes or ecosystems, we have discussed the threats to coral reefs. So coral reefs are going to be suffering pollution, okay, coming because of failed septic systems, for example, or chemicals that are dumped into the ocean, like some of your presentations have mentioned, any kind of pollutants coming in sunscreens, or any kind of development, coastal development as well, affect tourism effects on its own, right? So there are different ways in which I can affect all coral reefs. Now, one of the main factors, as you can see here, pollution involves sedimentation, toxins, pathogens, increased nutrients. So all of these are affecting, and they are contributing to this amount or increased sedimentations, increased amount of toxins, pathogens, and increased nutrients. So that is also affecting our coral reef communities. Also, we know that the ocean water has increased in its temperature, so that would be also affecting our coral reefs, the amount of sediment runoff. If we have more sediment runoff, it's going to change physically our water bed over here. It's going to change the amount of sediment that we have here, causing turbidity in the water as well, and also destructive fishing practices that will be affecting our coral reefs. So again, the types of pollution are over here. Where do they come from, right? What are they causing in our coral reef communities? And how we can help over here. Okay, now, for example, let's take one of those pollutants, the sunscreen chemicals. So most of the chemicals present in sunscreens, and you can corroborate this if you go and check your sunscreen or your even some of the moisturizers that we put on the skin every day will have this oxynobenzoate and oxynoacetate and oxynocriline and all of those chemicals, and most of them contain the same chemicals. Now, if I have these chemicals, what is affecting is once they get to the ocean, not only on coral reefs, but just in general on any kind of species living there. For example, in green algae, is going to not allow them to have, it's going to block the ability of green algae to do photosynthesis. In sea urchins, it's going to damage immune system, reproductive system. In coral reefs, in any kind of different organisms, is going to have an effect. So how can we protect ourselves if we are supposed to use sunscreen and protect ourselves from the sun? Well, there are again various ways that we can protect ourselves. But just so you know, when you put on sunscreen before going into the water to swim or just be in touch with the water, it's not like we stay with that amount of sunscreen, right? So those chemicals from our sunscreen are affecting our marine ecosystem because of the chemicals present in there. Okay, the next one is oil pollution. So some of you have presented case studies in terms of oil pollution, like the BP Horizon pollution group. So remember that case study. So oil pollution is when I have some kind of contamination, not necessarily from that has happened from some other source. Sometimes it starts at the bottom of the ocean. So because we also know that in the ocean we have the seeps, right, where we have this natural liquid of gaseous hydrocarbons that can actually provide us with oil. However, if there is a leak of that, these hydrocarbons tend to escape into the water, and because of currents, if they enter into the water column, they can be transported. And of course, this is not, the distance is not accurate. It can travel a long way, and it can pollute other areas. And if those hydrocarbons get deposited somewhere else, that is going to cause a fallout plume in which I'm going to have contamination of that area. So I can have hydrocarbons traveling into the water column, affecting whoever else is traveling on the water column, and I can affect also the bottom of the ocean just by the sedimentation or the accumulation, deposition of these hydrocarbons as well. So besides that, we can affect shorelines. So shorelines can be affected as well because of oil spills. Of course, we're affecting marine animals because of that, but not only marine animals in the surface of the ocean, but also in the water. For example, these are sea stars, and these sea stars are have been contaminated with oil, brittle stars. And so these brittle stars have been contaminated with oil, and then they start acquiring those toxins from those hydrocarbons and being affected into their ability to survive. Okay, so the oil again that washes on the beach have economic consequences for fishing and tourism, right? Nobody's gonna want to visit a place that looks like this. So again, sometimes it's not gonna come from other places, but sometimes it's gonna come just from the bottom of the ocean on its own. So that's gonna be affecting that. So again, if we looked at just a chart to compare how much consumption of petroleum that we have in North America in comparison to worldwide, we do have almost the same amount of consumption in terms of or compared to the rest of the world, which is, we do consume a lot of oil. Okay. And one of the ways, I don't know if I have included here, I might include it later, is that the ways that they try to clean oil pollution from the surface of the ocean is by using oil dispersants. But oil dispersants have other consequences. Okay, so how does oil impact marine life? Well, in terms of animals, what it's going to do is going to damage their external layer. It could be feathers in terms of birds, or it could be just their fur-bearing sections, like for sea otters, for example, right? And that will not allow that animal to be protected from water itself, right? So that water repellency that they naturally have is going to be affected. And then if they're exposed to that amount of water for such a long time, they will get to hypothermia. Now, ingestion of oil also could be another problem. So not only their skin or their skin layer, but they're also going to be ingesting oil when they are trying to clean themselves. You know that many birds or many animals, they clean themselves using their mouth or their beak, and they if they are in contact with oil, that might poison them as well. Again, oil is an organic compound, it's a mix of hydrocarbons. So when it enters into the water column and it travels, like I showed you on the previous slide, it will affect fish and shellfish. And what they will have is less growth, or they will have some other organ damage. And then that would also affect eggs and larvae. So there's a link here that you can see about the implications of oil spill. And also, these are some ways in which you could see how what's happening with this problem. So let's see if we can make it a little fast. Sometimes this doesn't work on this.
The trailing suction hopper dredges of Voskalis are ocean-going vessels that can collect sand and silt from the seabed and transport it over.
Of course. Well, anyway, you will have to see how there are other. Oh, I wish I could play it for you, but you can see here.
The draghead moves slowly over the bed, collecting the sand like a giant vacuum cleaner. The mixture of sand and water is...
Okay, so this video, maybe I'll show you in class, but this video is talking about the effect that collecting sand in order to provide beaches that might not have enough sand or that they need sand replacement has when I just kind of get sand from the bottom of the ocean and transport it into a specific beach to relocate the sand. Imagine, those machines going under the water, and there are animals living on the sea floor, and the effect that it would have just from those suction hook deals to go under the water and get the sand. So that's another problem on the marine ecosystems, including coral reefs as well. Anyway, so ways to remediate oil pollutants can be, again, the booms, like some of your classmates have mentioned in class, because that would just kind of isolate the location of the spill. Some chemicals that break the oil, such as the dispersants that I was telling you about, before that oil gets all the way to the shoreline. And bacteria. So this is a new thing. Bacteria, there are some research studies that have shown that, or they found that bacteria that there is this species of bacteria that can consume oil. So we have the dispersants. The dispersants are usually coming on those planes, and they are being spread out over the areas where the oil has, but these dispersants also have other chemicals that will affect life. Okay, so we also have the bacteria again, and the bacteria is the one that was found under the ocean, and they tested it and they made studies, and supposedly it could help to consume the oil spills. So that could be a possible solution. However, it's not used yet because it's not that easy to just make bacteria eat all that oil anyways. I believe, let's see if this one is not that long. Well, I guess it didn't play. Let's see.
New oil-eating microbes found in Mariana Trench. Scientists say these new microbes could potentially help clean up oil spills. According to a new study published in the journal Microbiome, microorganisms that consume oil were found in the southern end of the Mariana Trench, which is the world's deepest ocean trench. Bacteria such as Olibacter, Thalassolitus, and Alcanoborax genera were found in the depths of the Challenger Deep trench, as well as serve as a food source.
Okay, so this bacteria that was found on the Mariana Trench is supposed to help with that. Again, look at where it's located. The access to that is a little bit not possible. It's not easy to have a lab fabricating that and then retransporting those bacteria back into those locations wherever the oil has spilled. It's not a something that was that has been used too much, but again, it's a possible solution. Okay, so marine dead zones. So marine dead zones, or MDZs, was a term that was coined by the NOAA, and they determine specific places in which there is less or very low oxygen level in the water. And every time that I have less oxygen in the water, that's going to be referred as hypoxia. And hypoxia is when I have very, very low oxygen level. And when I have no oxygen at all in that location, is called anoxia. So anoxia, it means I have 0 milligrams of oxygen per liter of water. And then hypoxia or hypoxia is going to be when the concentration of oxygen is less than 200 milligrams per liter of water. So these marine dead zones sometimes occur naturally and sometimes are enhanced by human activity. And there are different ways that I can contribute to produce these marine dead zones. Usually, or the main cause of a dead zone is nutrient pollution. And by nutrient pollution, I'm talking about eutrophication. So that's going to be the main source, okay, because it has caused eutrophication in different places, as we're going to see in 8.5. So the example of this one, the first marine dead zone was the east coast of the Gulf of Mexico. We also have the marine dead zone in the Great Lakes, as one of your classmates or a couple of your classmates mentioned in the case studies. So Gulf of Mexico and the Great Lakes, and the second one was on the northern Gulf of Mexico. Now, right now, we have about 400 ocean dead zones worldwide. So that is a lot of places worldwide just of dead zones. Now, some of these dead zones can be reversible. For example, the Black Sea dead zone disappeared between 1991 and 2001, but they spent millions of dollars and recover that. But what happened was right now we have fertilizers, and that's the problem for the Black Sea dead zone. So after fertilizers, I don't know how reversible this is happening because it's again turning into a problem. Okay, so how the dead zone forms? So first we're gonna have, during the spring, we have the sun hitting the fresh water. For example, this is the example of what happened on the Mississippi River. And what's gonna happen is I have regular, life happening. I don't have any accumulation or anything. But if I have accumulation coming with fresh water, it's gonna bring the nutrients from any agricultural lands somewhere from wherever the river is coming. So if I have that, remember that fertilizers are going to have two main nutrients, and that is usually on test questions. The two main nutrients are going to be nitrogen and phosphorus. You can also have potassium, but nitrogen and phosphorus are going to be the main minerals coming from fertilizers. So what happens is if I have nutrients, it will make my algae bloom happen, and then if I have algae bloom because nutrients, so the algae is growing and reproducing, it's gonna cover the top of it, and then there is no more oxygen for produce because there's no more light, right? And then there is no more nutrients because they just ate all the nutrients that just came on that runoff. So now the algae starts dying, and as that algae starts dying, it's gonna start being decomposed. So then we have a lot of activity from our bacteria, right? And then the bacteria will use up all the oxygen, and then I don't have oxygen for other aquatic life. So then we don't have nothing. We have a place that has no oxygen, and that is called a dead zone. So there's no life pretty much. Okay, so we have some eutrophic places in which we could say that they have a various increase of plankton in themselves, and then it dies, and then it does all this process that we already know. We also have some hypoxic places which they do not have a lot of oxygen, right? Of course, it's going to be along the coast. And then we have a few zones of recovery as well. Natural factors for creation of dead zones are going to be slow water circulation or mixing of water, the changes in weather, the high growth algae, the loading of carbon and nitrogen just as part of their own cycles. But the human induced is going to be if I alter the river flow, if I don't have enough forest or something to prevent the runoff, is going to make this adding of nutrients faster. So this is another one as well, already dead, right? And then some that are just of concern. Okay, this is on the test, dissolved oxygen and biological oxygen demand. So they relate to each other inversely. And dissolved oxygen is the amount of oxygen that I have available in any body of water. However, the biological oxygen demand is how much oxygen, that body of water needs for any kind of life that is in that place. So it's going to be a type of quality indicator. So if I have a low dissolved oxygen, right, that means there is a high pollution. So I need to have a lot of dissolved oxygen. Now, this biological oxygen demand is going to be inversely related to the dissolved oxygen. So if I have a high BOD, that means that I have a low OD. That means I'm in trouble. It's polluted, right? And the other way around. So for example, if I have a lake or a place or a water sample that has a 4 to a 4.5 BOD, that means it's heavily polluted, right? So that's dissolved oxygen, right? So anyway, it's something that we need to think about. We're gonna go back to this dissolved oxygen and we're gonna look at pollutants level later, but it's usually measured in parts per million at just room temperature, not room temperature, just kind of external temperature or water temperature. So again, if I have a good DO, which is dissolved oxygen, I'm going to have good life because it looks like it won't be polluted. I want to have a very high DO and a very low BOD. Okay, so what is an oxygen sag curve? An oxygen sag curve is going to be formed because of a point source pollutant or pollution source. So in here, I have a point source, right? This is a point source. And an oxygen sag curve is going to tell me the amount of oxygen as I go down the stream. So, or a lake. So for example, that oxygen level is going to be at 8 parts per million, right? That dissolved oxygen is going to be high, normal. I have very specialist species over here. They are abundant, high diversity, and all that. My BOD is very low, right? Because I have a high DO. However, when that point source starts contaminating my body of water, I'm going to have to see how my DO levels are going to go down and my BOD levels start going up, right? Therefore, some of these species will start disappearing, right? And that would be in our decomposition zone, in which I see some animals dying. I also see other animals. There is a septic zone. We're going to get to talk about septic zone in a moment. But then this pollution type is going to start kind of spread out and become more diluted. So then once I pass that level, I'm going to start seeing again regular or normal number of species according to my amount of dissolved oxygen. So the more dissolved oxygen I have, I would have again those species that I used to have, and my BOD goes down, then that means I have enough oxygen to help my species survive. So that would be my clean zone. The recovery zone is like the middle zone in between my BOD and my OD. So again, this is an oxygen sag curve. I think it's very easy to understand. Okay, another type of pollution, heavy metals. They are usually linked to groundwater, but that's not the only way that heavy metals get into us. We have seen a little bit about this in the previous chapter. So where do we get heavy metals from? Usually from any kind of plating shops or smelters or just atmospheric deposition, as you mentioned it in some of your case studies. Natural sources are going to come from tailings, just from mining, of course, and from certain soil conditions, right? If there is a lot of erosion, we might have some exposure to some heavy metals. Now, why do we care about heavy metals? Because they're going to contaminate our groundwater, and if we think our groundwater is the source of our drinking water. So there is a cleanup liability. There are different types of sources, as we just seen, and there is complex behavior with the heavy metals. So we have, for example, cadmium and mercury, and of course we have a list over here of other heavy metals that the water should contain or that contains. But if it passes those limits, it shouldn't be a source for drinking water, which is a problem. Now, heavy metals, what happens is metals are gonna coexist. If you remember your chemistry classes, metals are gonna try to join to non-metals to form ionic bonds, right? So they do have a strong attraction because of their ions. So these ions of heavy metals will attract major ions such as calcium sulfate carbonate and water as well. So those metal ions can form these complexes with other ions depending on how much there are. And of course, if we looked at calcium sulfate carbonate, those are ions that are also present in the soil. So they're gonna tend to bind to those surfaces around it. Okay, and once they do that, they will affect whatever water quality or soil as well around them. So there is an explanation here of mercury poisoning, but again, these are some of the ways, but we also have to think about our pipes themselves. Our pipes are metal, and these metals can also come from the piping system from our water as well. So heavy metals. Okay, so continue talking about heavy metals. Okay, the reason why we care about heavy metals is because they could cause health issues, such as the one over here. It can affect our skin, our teeth, for example, and we consume that as well. So if we have heavy metals reaching into a specific location, and then we eat that delicious salmon or any other kind of fish that contains mercury or that contains cadmium or any other heavy metal, then will be affected by that exposure. This one over here is showing that mercury is also another metal, right? When it enters the water, bacteria in the water will make that mercury kind of like active. They will transform it into toxic methyl mercury, which would enter into a food chain. So that's a problem. And we'll get to see that with biomagnification later on. This is, for example, an abandoned underground mine floods with groundwater in which pyrite breaks into iron and hydrogen, and it's going to make that water acidic. So those places that are abandoned mines, for example, are a very high source of heavy metals. Now, heavy metal sources, one more time, can come from all the different places over here that will contaminate the soil. And then, so not only in the water, that pollution of heavy metals will happen, but also in the soil. So let's look at the soil contamination. If we have all of these sources coming, of course, all of those are anthropogenic, and then we contaminate the soil with heavy metals, you will have that any plant will have two types of uptake for those heavy metals. One is the root uptake, in which because it reaches in the ground, the roots will take it up, and then it will go up to any kind of the plant, or the foliar, which is taken by the leaf, right, uptake, in which the heavy metals enter into the plant via the stomata and the cuticle. And I believe you do know those terms, but if not, the stomata are these pores under the leaves in which usually there is gas exchange happening. But if there are heavy metals also carried in water, then these places would be entry passes for those heavy metals as well. And also through the cuticle. The cuticle is just a waxy layer of leaves, but that would not prevent heavy metals from entering into a plant. Again, that would affect our human health, especially if we're consuming those plants, right? Like let's say it's corn or any kind of vegetable. Okay, so another topic is called pollution with microplastics, or just plastic in general, or litter. So our litter is gonna be mainly plastic. And as we discussed in class, microplastics are a big problem. So yes, we know that there are other problems with plastic in the surface of the water, right? Because of the amount of plastic that makes it into the ocean every second. Look at that, it's 500 pounds per second that enters into the ocean. That's a lot. Now, there are some research studies that have found that the microplastics are going to have some PETs, which are these chemicals or these leftovers from plastic. And remember that plastic comes from oil. And the problem is that this plastic is not coming from any kind of fishing lines or some other activities in the ocean, but it's actually coming um, from human plastic. So PETs are chemicals found in plastic that are plastic of consumers, not of fishing lines. And it's called the plastic in the ocean. When it gets into this microplastic stage, that means that plastic that reaches at about 1,000 meters under the ocean. There has been microplastic found at about 600 meters in kind of like is the most concentrated area that has microplastics. It's a problem because it looks like a snow. It's actually called the snow of the ocean, the microplastic, and it's a problem. So again, some of your classmates mentioned it in their presentation of plastic about the problem with microbeads in some of our products for cleaning products or skin products, and how that is a problem because it contains plastic residues. And also, again, if those plastics enter into the food chain and they are confused by any kind of food, or they are just absorbed because those animals are trying to eat or whatever, they will enter into the food chain, and that's a problem. So let's watch those two videos in class to make sure that we have a higher understanding of microplastic. Okay, another type of pollution, sediment accumulation versus light infiltration. So sediment accumulation is going to have two problems, a physical and a chemical dimension. The main cause of sediment accumulation is agriculture. And if you remember from soil, we have these four types of particles in the soil, which of course are what sediment refers to, right? So the flow would decrease if I have a high level of sediment. Now, naturally, we have had always sediment accumulation. For example, river deltas have formed in the past, and we do know some river deltas. So a river delta is a natural accumulation of sediments, usually in a low-lying plain, where I have abundant wildlife, where I have waterways for trade routes or whatever, and at places in which we have a very high population in river deltas because of the ability of those places to provide a lot of ecosystem services as well. Now, the sediments are also deposited on land where the river overflows its bank during a flood. So that means if I have a very high level of sediments, I'm going to decrease the volume of or the space available for water to continue flowing. So that is a problem for flooding. We'll see it in a moment. Now, usually, the role is to regenerate the soils because it provides essential nutrients to wetland areas. So again, it occurs naturally because it brings those nutrients. So along with clay, silt, sand, and gravel, when that sediment travels, it should bring some nutrients. However, we have this pollution because we have excessive amounts. And because of those excessive amounts of particles that accumulate, they will cause different floods, for example, or extra nutrient level at those places. The causes again come from agricultural land, from forest soil exposed by logging, from the graded stream banks, or any of all the other options over here. Now, one way to prevent sediment accumulation that is not natural is the control of soil erosion. That actually, and again, is highlighted here because it is important to know that if I control soil erosion, I would reduce the amount of sediment that gets into the waterways and clog places or drainage systems as well. Okay, so the consequences of sediment pollution, there is a video here that we can link to. This I just took directly from one of the previous slides on the previous unit on soil, and I explained a little bit on the connection in between the soil particles and the ions. If you didn't understand that part, you can go back to this one as well. There is further explanation on that video. This video is the same as this. So if you don't know how ions are connected to soil particles and how they attach and detach once they are in the ground, this is representing a root hair cell from a plant absorbing those ions. Take a look at that. Take a look at this video and remind yourself on how that happens. Okay, so the consequences of sediment pollution again is going to reduce the light penetration in areas in marine ecosystems, right? So for example, this is going to look clear. I'm going to have plenty of light penetration, which allows photosynthesis, which allows production of oxygen. So my dissolved oxygen levels are high. I have biodiversity and everything. However, if I have a lot of sediment, there is a lot of turbidity, and turbidity is not a good thing. We're going to measure turbidity for this water sample, and that's turbidity is measured with a little device that's called the Secchi disc, and we're going to get to use that one in class. Okay, so again, it's going to reduce the light penetration, it's going to clog any kind of gills in animals because of the amount of sediment or any kind of feeding structures from any of those marine species. And it's a problem in coral reefs and shellfish beds because I'm going to physically increase the amount of sediment at the bottom of the ocean, which is just changing the way that the bottom of the ocean is set, right? It also brings insoluble toxic pollutants that are organic and inorganic, even disease-causing agents as well. It's going to fill in waterways, in lakes and channels. So if I'm going to have a ship passing through that, sediment affects the passing of the ship through those places as well. It can also affect the shipping industry because of these. And again, I already told you how to measure that. Okay. Endocrine disruptors. So 8.3, endocrine disruptors, if you remember what an endocrine system is, so endocrine system is the system in our body that is going to help us with the production of hormones, and it's going to help us to maintain homeostasis. But there are these chemicals that are being produced by us in different products that are called endocrine disruptors because they disrupt the hormones from our endocrine system. So, and then we're going to see the effects of this. Okay, so again, endocrine disruptors are chemicals that are coming from industries and agriculture that will show persistence and bioaccumulation and biomagnification and will affect our endocrine system. Usually, those involve compounds that are called chlorine-containing industrial compounds, such as PCBs and dioxins. You do need to know that list, so make sure you take a look at this and memorize this list. We have heavy metals that are also endocrine disruptors, pesticides as well, flame retardants, plastics, and plastic additives. And these plastic and plastic additives come on just water bottles by themselves as well. So this video explains how endocrine disruptors work. There are other ones over here, some of these, and what specifically they go and damage our system, and then what are the effects of health effects that they have in our bodies. So it is important that we take a look at how they affect human health. And if let's go back and refresh our mind to what the endocrine system looks like. So the endocrine system is kind of going to be monitored by this gland in our hypothalamus, and it's called the pituitary gland or the master gland. And the pituitary gland is going to be producing different hormones, and it's also going to control the release of other hormones from my other endocrine glands. Other endocrine glands involve, for example, the thyroid and parathyroid. That means we have both of these. It's not like girls and guys have that. No, it's just we have both of those. We have our adrenal glands producing adrenaline. We have the pancreas producing insulin. And then we have the reproductive hormones, right? So we have estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. That doesn't mean we do not produce testosterone. Women also produce testosterone in small levels, and guys produce also some estrogen as well. However, when we have these chemicals disrupting these hormones, it could lead to different problems. And if you want to sum it up, it disrupts directly reproductive hormones. Those are the main causes. Yes, it affects other hormones like the thyroid, for example, or other glands, like the thyroid, but the main problem is sterility. So let's look into it. And again, I'm going to try to play just the videos in class and see what happens. Okay, so there was a case study in 1980 of a chemical spill in the Lake Apopka in Florida. And what happened was that there was a concentration of chemicals that affected the male alligators. So it was observed that these alligators started to exhibit very low testosterone levels. So their their male parts were very, very tiny. They have some, if you want to call it, some feminine behaviors, and they weren't able to survive, and they were not able to reproduce, because if they don't have a I believe alligators have two penises, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, they were not able to reproduce because their penises were non-functional, and if they were trying to have any kind of feminine display, or they did not have enough testosterone, they would not. They have to like battle with each other for females to reproduce, but they didn't have that. So there was a big effect because there was not a lot of reproduction happening. So the whole population went down after that chemical spill. So they also studied that these alligators' effect slowly went back up once they clean up that chemical spill, but it affected that. Now that's not the only, and because of that what happened, like humans have the same thing. That's not the only thing, but that was one case study. Okay, so after that, we had other researchers doing different tests on what exactly or which ones are chemical disruptors. And the problem with this was that for the first time, they found out that it was not easy to study chemicals that are foreign to the human body. So they just kind of study chemicals that do not belong to the human body, and they found out that 24 out of the 28 chemicals of the human body were like they have never seen in the past. Like they didn't know where they come from. They just knew that they do not belong to the human body. So they had like no base to say, okay, this is disrupting the endocrine system or not. So they do know after they did further studies, and they studied looking at other chemicals that could affect our endocrine system. And let me tell you about that over here, but let me just finish this. But right now we continue having some endocrine disruptors because just of regular products that we consume in our diet. So for example, if we have soy milk is going to have estrogens, or any kind of like bean curd or soy-based foods, they're going to have estrogens just because of that's the content of that milk or those products, and they mimic hormones. And if you remember something about biology, hormones are these chemicals that are going to have receptors on the cells before they enter into the cell. So the endocrine disruptor works by mimicking or looking like those chemicals, like the hormones that we have, and they enter, but they do not have the same effect. So there is no cellular responses being produced. So example of other endocrine disruptors, or example of endocrine disruptors. What kind of chemicals? Phthalates. I don't know if you heard about phthalates before, but they are found in cosmetics. They are found in hair products, in nail polish and treatments, and it's of health concern because it's disrupting the endocrine system. It's causing reproductive toxicity and bioaccumulation as well. It's even found in coffee capsules, and that was shocking to me when I was looking at this, just because I do sometimes consume coffee capsules, and that was a little sad, but it is true. So endocrine disruptors could be heavy metals, right? Like I told you, and we have some metals over here, some heavy metals that could cause also some effects like this. Now, the chemical spills, a chemical spill can cause reproductive disorder, can cause infertility cases. They started studying the effects of that, and they found that some of the problems could be testicular and breast cancers, for example, and how that has increased since they found other chemicals. Now, more than 60 studies since 1938 have reported, this is an example, have reported 50% sperm count dropped in a total of 15,000 men from many nations, including the US. So, if you think about this, why do I care about the amount of sperm count in males? Well, because it doesn't matter that I only need one sperm to fertilize an egg. Usually, males that are not fertile, right, that cannot have babies, is because they have a very low sperm count. Now, a very low sperm count can have different causes, so it's not only chemicals or endocrine disruptors, but they do need to have a certain amount of sperm in order to reach all the way to the ovary, right? Once they are deposited into the vagina, they are not deposited into the vagina. That's why they need to swim all the way up the top. So if I don't have enough sperm, it's not gonna help us into having a sperm that will be able to swim through the acidity of our reproductive system and make it all the way to fertilize an egg. So just having a low sperm count is one of the causes for fertility, because I don't have enough that will survive, since most of them die anyways. Okay, phthalates. Phthalates have been found to cause hypospadias, and hypospadias is what I have this picture over here. A hypospadia is when I have the urethra of the guys being located at a different place instead of the regular place that is usually here. It's going to be located at the base of the glans or under it. So it's going to be in places where it's not supposed to be, and that is not normal, right? We also have phthalates also cause breast development in babies or in girls that are between 6 and 24 months old, which is not normal. So another endocrine disruptor is bisphenol A or BPA. You've probably seen in some water bottle that says BPA free or whatever. They are present in baby bottles and they are present in sport drink containers. Again, I mentioned in class for one of the blogs, I mentioned that BPAs have been banned in California, but they have not been banned in the United States. So that is an issue as well. Okay, and we have the human impact on wetlands and mangroves. So this human impact has to bring you back to our aquatic biomes. So if you look at the mangroves over here, the locations for mangroves, right, and the important in ecosystem services that they offer, look where they are located, right? So we're going to talk about them. What's the difference, right? Okay, in general, we're going to have wetland is an area in which I have the water covering that soil for either part of all the time, just a wetland. A type of wetland are marshlands, right? So why do I care about that? Because when I have precipitation, just in general, what's going to happen is I'm going to have, if I have an undisturbed place, I'm going to have a lot of evaporation, transpiration, I'm going to have surface runoff less and groundwater recharge. However, when I have an urban area, I'm going to have less transpiration, I'm going to have more runoff, so probable floods, and I'm going to have less groundwater recharge because there's nothing that can filtrate over here. Example. And what is the place? La Merced. La Merced, California in 2006 had this issue. And we're going to look at what happened in there. But it was because of flooding, of course. You probably know about this. And the issue with that and other places is the presence of levees and how that produces different disagreements in between areas that have floods at different places. However, floods have a natural cause, like they've always been there. It's not like we have not ever had floods and now that we are, urbanized or whatever, we have floods. They have been an issue since the past, but ancient cultures like Egypt or any other culture, they used to take advantage of those floods in order to allow the recharge of nutrients and water from the soil and have again a high nutrient level. The problem is how we are dealing with these floods and we're not taking advantage of that. So this is a picture directly from your book that has they suggested that a possible solution for flooding is the construction of the levees. So the levees are like these kind of like raised up levels of land around the river. So when I have rain, they would not overpass and affect a population, a town that's living on the sides of each. So they said, well, instead of having these kind of levees that are very close to the river, why don't we have levees that are like a little farther away and let the normal course of that river to continue going, and then just kind of like all this area would be flooded and it would be taken advantage of, we can replenish the nutrients and so on. However, the construction of levees is very expensive and not everybody or not every town or place can afford a construction of it. Okay. So Wetlands, going back to wetlands. One type of wetlands are called the marshlands. And I just kind of capture the screen from this slide presentation from Unit 1, in which we talked about these kind of ecosystems. So what is a marshland? A marshland is a type of wetland that's dominated by herbaceous plant, right? Instead of woody plants, remember that? So it's usually found at the edges of streams and lakes, and we can further have a fresh marshland or a saltwater marshland. Okay, so we have the marshes, for example, right? Again, marshes are grass-like. They do have herbaceous plants, and they are highly productive. They can be used as habitat, or they are habitat, food source, water storage for rivers and groundwater. They offer ecosystem services as well. We talked about the Everglades in Florida, and just to introduce, the mangroves are a tree, those trees that have these crazy roots, and I'll show you on the next slide. So mangroves. Mangroves are found along about 70% of gently sloping sandy and silty coastlines in tropical and subtropical regions. So remember the functions of these roots and how they are important for the growth of the mangroves. And remember that these places of wetlands are gonna have a specific function. They can recharge water, they can recharge ponds, they can recharge rivers, and they have a very high diversity of aquatic life as well. So it is important. Again, these are again some of the print screens that I got from the previous PowerPoints that we have covered. The problem is that we do have some of these places and wetlands that have been affected because of the construction of dams, for example, right? Remember that they are also act like sponges, and they kind of like hold all the pollution there, so the pollution cannot continue into the river or whatever. So they filter the pollution as well. They reduce the storm damage and all that. So again, take a look at this, because this is something that you're supposed to know already. These are some of the ecological services just from freshwater systems in general, and some from the marine systems as well. So what are the main threats for wetlands and marshlands? It's going to be shrimp farming, okay, because of developing of shrimp farming is affecting these places, because of tourism as well, agriculture, aquaculture, salt production, coastal development, we're kind of getting rid of them, deforestation, charcoal and lumber industries, and that would, in the extinction itself, there has been many wetlands extinct that have gone extinct. And I have 2 videos here that I want to show you in class as well. But these are the main that are, if you want to read more about it, go to these places. I have 3, 1, 2, and 3. You can just kind of skim over. It's going to take you like a minute or less to read a little bit more about these threats for marshlands and wetlands. And the last topic, eutrophication. So eutrophication is a topic that you already know. Is when the water body receives too much nitrogen or phosphorus, then the algae bloom, we already talked about it, increased phytoplankton, and then what happens, decomposition, bacterial population grows, and then DO, super low, BOD, super high, no life, right? Anoxic. Okay, symptoms of eutrophication. What happens there? How do I know if a place is going through eutrophication? The natural sources of eutrophication. So eutrophication is a natural process, right? But we are doing a cultural eutrophication. What we do is a cultural eutrophication. On the test, main 2 causes of cultural eutrophication is going to be the runoff from agriculture, so agricultural runoff because of nitrogen and phosphorus mainly, and also because of wastewater release, which is our domestic sewage. Now, other sources of pollution are also contributing to eutrophication, but this would be the main 2 that you need to know. Now, the negative impacts, if I have a eutrophied lake, is going to be that I depleted the oxygen, either by hypoxia or anoxia, right, which harms the aquatic life. I'm going to let the native fish die or disappear and let other species grow in its place, like the generalis. I'm going to affect the beaches or shoreline. I'm going to provide with too many nutrients. That's why it's eutrophied instead of oligotrophied. So a regular lake, a normal lake without too many nutrients, is called oligotrophic. Oligo means some nutrients. But if I gave it too much, it's called eutrophication. Plenty of nutrients, too many. Like the Chesapeake Bay, right? We had that on one of the case studies again. And what happened was the blue crabs and the bay grasses couldn't survive in there because of eutrophication. And if we have also those nutrients of, allowing other organisms to live, that would affect human health as well because of nitrates present that are poisoning the intestines and contaminated water from those locations. Again, we also know that there is an algae mat formation and that there is a decreased light level that can penetrate. Control. How can we prevent eutrophication? With new and improved sewage treatment plants, improve control over sources of pollutants, like for example, the amount of phosphates in detergent. And the Clean Water Act was actually one solution that took place, and it was helpful in the cleaning of the Lake Erie. So that lake was recovered. So thanks to that. Remembering where the water pollutants, so that human wastewater, which is one of the causes of eutrophication, comes from, will be, again, water pollutants, sewage, disease-causing agents. Those are the types of pollutants that I'm carrying on the human wastewater, right? Sediment pollution, inorganic, algae nutrients, radioactive substances, thermal pollution. What is human wastewater and the 3 reasons for concern, which I just mentioned. Eutrophication, this is another chart I can explain to you and relay that to what we already discussed in what is an oxygen sac curve and what is dissolved oxygen. Simply put, eutrophication, if you still need to review that, and another last chart that's telling you what's happening in eutrophication. That was it.